Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending from where you're joining us from. Welcome to the webinar on COVID-19 and the future of multilateralism. It is a pleasure indeed that you're joining us today for this webinar, and we're looking forward very much to the presentations and the discussions with you in this webinar. My name is Bruno. I'm the task force coordinator of Task Force 5, the task force on the future of multilateralism and global governance. As coordinator, my home turf here are logistical and organizational questions. So let me briefly walk you through what is going to happen here for the next 2 hours. We're going to start with a brief welcome by Dr. Abdulaziz Sagar, who's the lead co-chair of the task force. Subsequently, we're fortunate to have opening remarks by Dr. Fahad Al-Turki, the chair of T20, and subsequently by Sarah Alhusseini from G20. After that, we are going to listen to a panel that is going to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on multilateralism and global governance, which consists of co-authors from our task force who are going to present both their policy briefs and are giving us insights into 4 different fields that the COVID-19 pandemic has an impact on. For example, multilateralism, climate governance, security issues, and AI regulations. Subsequently, we are going to listen to the presentations of the remaining policy briefs that our task force has produced. That is going to be a 4-minute presentation each, which leaves us approximately 25 to 30 minutes for the Q&A session. As some general remarks, I would just like to remind everyone to just please mute yourself if you are not presenting, because otherwise it can get a bit noisy during the presentations. Secondly, any question you may have or you would like to ask, please feel free to either send it directly to me or just put it into the Q&A chat. And once we reach the Q&A stage, I'm happy to read them out to start the discussion. So if you know whom you'd like to answer this question, please indicate whom you're addressing the question to. Thirdly, to the presenters, please make sure you don't exceed the time that is allocated to your slot, just to make sure we can we keep on track and stick to the timeline. And finally, just as a general information for everyone, this is going to be recorded and put subsequently on YouTube. So with no further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Abdulaziz.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, depends in which part of the world you are. We have from Argentina all the way to LA, to Riyadh, Jeddah, Abu Dhabi, and different Geneva, different destination. But welcome all, and I really appreciate taking the time and the effort and being with us in this webinar and discussing, the different policy brief that we had. I'm sure it's a great effort, and you all have put, a great time and a great effort to, in all the, preparation that have taken place and the paper presentation and the policy brief and so on. It's going to be an interesting, discussion today. We have a very good and excellent, policy brief that you're going to listen to. We're looking forward to hear a lot of different questions on the topic and make it a very fruitful discussion. I'm not going to take much of the time because we would rather use it for the presenter and for the other, but I will pass to Dr. Fahad for all the effort you're putting as a part of the T20 group. And it's been quite successful until now. We hope it will all be, the completion of the great success, and we move forward. So the floor is yours, Dr. Fahad.
Thank you, Abdulaziz, and it's a pleasure to connect with all of you today. I would like to thank everybody for participating in this T20 webinar. A special thanks to Dr. Abdulaziz bin Sagar and the coordinator for this task force, Bruno, for all the efforts put into organizing this webinar. And also a special thank to the co-chairs of this task force for their continuous support on the priorities for this task force. We've seen a very high level of contribution, quality policy briefs that were submitted in April within the timeline that we announced early this year. And I would like to extend my thank and appreciation to Sarah Alhusseini, the chair of Tourism Working Group, for participating today and giving us some idea of how the Tourism Working Group changing their agenda given the pandemic. Before I turn the mic to Sarah, I would like to mention a few things related to what we are doing at the T20 and how we are changing our agenda related to COVID-19 and how we can link all of this to the priorities of this task force. So, but let me first note that the COVID-19 pandemic is above all a human tragedy and perhaps the most significant civilizational threat that we have faced in our lifetime. By now, COVID-19 has spread to more than 4 million people in 180 countries, or over 180 countries, a rate of infection that we have never seen in more than a century. Of course, the cost of this pandemic is significant, not only on the healthcare system, but also on our social life, the economy, and the market. Even well-structured and strong and well-funded healthcare systems are struggling to keep up with the impact of the pandemic. And the socio-economic impact of this crisis is very clear. The IMF is forecasting that global economic growth is turning into the negative territory, around -3% this year, the largest contraction that we have seen since the Great Depression. And they're expecting a forecast of 5%, positive 5% this next year. As an economist, I doubt that we will recover this fast, this quickly. So I think they are a little bit optimistic, especially that unemployment is soaring in many countries. Unemployment now is reaching double digits in many advanced economies. SMEs are going out of business, and even large corporations are facing difficulty managing their cash flows. Inequality are deepening, and we as individuals and communities are unable to meet the needs of the most vulnerable households, including the elderly and vulnerable individuals in many places. So at the country level, countries are faced with two hard and contradicting choices. On one side, if they act immediately and lock down, they risk 1,000 of deaths related to COVID-19 and overwhelm their healthcare system. And on the other side, if they don't act immediately and lock down, and rather they shut down the economy, they will experience an economic meltdown and collapse, and probably high rate of mortality from non-COVID-19 related reasons, especially in poor countries. We come together as a group, as a T20, and also as a part of the G20 to highlight that we should learn from a previous global crisis, where global unity and solidarity should be on top of our priorities. As we highlighted at the T20 statement since early March, we need urgent investments in critical public services and global public goods to first suppress the virus and to minimize the social and economic impact of the pandemic. And that will put us on the right path to recover better with a more sustainable and resilient society. The COVID-19 pandemic is a harsh reminder of our common fate and of the need for immediate investment action to reduce the devastating implications on our societies and the economy. Trying to cope with the immediate devastating impact of the virus, many countries initially imposed unprecedented executive measures, including closing borders. A virus, however, knows no borders, and as we see, all countries are being affected. The fight against this global pandemic, which took many lives already and impacted our society, is a stark reminder that the world need more, not less, multilateral collaboration and global solidarity. Many of the lead co-chairs in this task force remember when we had a discussion about the priority for this task force back in December and January. We decided that the priorities for this task force will be the future of multilateralism, reforming existing international organizations to take on new global problems, the future of politics, democracy, and the rising protectionism and the impact of economic downturn, regional engagement for more effective and efficient global governance, innovative and interactive strategies and programs of global governance. The reason I'm mentioning these priorities that we agreed on back in December is because they are more important now than they were back in December under the current pandemic and the implications of the pandemic. And I would like to say that multilateralism is about the cooperation in pursuit of a common goal. The actions of government, people, and organization are an essential part of the multilateral landscape, especially now when some governments and established structures are not only failing to help people survive, but also created a system that are leading to increased suffering during the time, not only during this time, not only health-wise, but also economically and socially. From our part as a T20, we have issued the 3 official T20 statements before and after the extraordinary summit for the G20 at the end of March. In this statement, we called for a coordinated stimulus package to allocate resources for businesses, workers, and households, especially in less developing countries. Some of the recommendations that we highlighted within these statements that are related to the work of this task force includes opening borders, restoring global supply chain, reversing a slowdown in global trade, improving access to medical supply, and reversing the decline in international aid. And in addition to this, we highlighted that there is signs of emerging debt crisis if we do not act quickly and allow poor countries immediately to suspend debt payments and reassess debt sustainability. If these actions are not taken seriously and we do not address the pandemic on a rather quick basis, this pandemic is likely to threaten to destabilize developing countries and also global stability and global balances. As observed in early data and also based on the experience of 2008 and 2009 financial crisis, where the economic impact and the social impact of the meltdown have been far worse if not for the extraordinary policy and programmatic approach taken by many governments. These measures were coupled with the assistance provided by various development partners, including the international financial institutions and multilateral development banks. We should repeat that experience in the face of this pandemic, and we should follow and support recommendations that support in this direction. This event will highlight that and highlight the importance of the think tanks and the think tanks' contribution to the global economy and the global community in meeting the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the context of this task force, the crisis might play a constructive role in rebuilding multilateralism after countries realize that there is a serious course to the danger of looking inward rather than outward. So I encourage you all to actively participate in the webinar and contribute to the T20 process by maintaining our core mandate, which is providing unbiased research-based policy recommendations to the leaders of the world. And given the magnitude of this crisis, I think we need to go beyond even just giving policy recommendations, but also suggest initiatives for the leaders of the G20 to reform and rebuild existing international organizations to better deal with the pandemic. And remember, reforming and rebuilding international organizations is one of the priorities of this task force. To conclude, I would like to say once again that the T20 and its partners are devoting their time and effort to help the world in facing the pandemic. And that event like this bring us together and encourage us to share our expertise. We look forward to working further with all of you and our partners across G20 and non-G20 countries to expedite a transition to recovery, while also maintaining our global connectivity and effective multilateral system. Thank you for your time, and back to you, Dr. Abdulaziz.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fahad, for this outstanding overview and the impact of the COVID and how this will encourage multilateralism, cooperation. We only hope that we will overcome this pandemic soon, and gradually life will go back to normal. Now I will turn to Sarah Alhusseini. She's the chair of the tourism group. So she's the general director also for the international cooperation at the Ministry of Tourism in Saudi Arabia and the chair of the G20 tourism working group. Sarah, the floor is yours, and please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And it's an honor to be here today to discuss such a prevalent topic and one that's hotly contested by our world as it continues to change so drastically. Of course, a special thank you to Dr. Abdulaziz Sagir and Dr. Fahad Turki, Bruno, and the T20 team for inviting me to speak, and of course for their leadership of such an important engagement group during these times as we look for impartial knowledge, experience, and recommendations to navigate the unknown. A little bit of background about myself. Of course, as mentioned, my name is Sarah Alhusseini. I'm the General Director for International Cooperation at the Saudi Ministry of Tourism and the chair of the Tourism Working Group during our exciting presidency year. I started my career as a Saudi diplomat posted to the UN in New York. And so I'm a multilateralist at heart, which makes the necessity for collaborative multilateral action a topic for which I'm very passionate about. At the start of the year, as we looked ahead to what this year's G20 presidency might involve, I'm not sure any of us really envisioned the challenges to come. We are also trying to come to terms with the great impact of this pandemic and that what it's having on our families, our communities, and our livelihoods, while also trying to plan our recovery and map the way forward. It goes without saying that as a whole, the Tourism Working Group recognizes that the tourism sector is one of the worst affected by COVID-19. Travel restrictions, border closures, quarantines, and social distancing have meant that travel and tourism has grounded to almost a complete halt. And Saudi Arabia is no different. The country just opened to tourists less than 8 months ago. Prior to the crisis, we saw a nascent sector of the economy rapidly expanding and providing opportunities to underserved sectors of society across the country. Now, with millions of jobs at risk around the world and the private sector in need of our assistance, governments are doing all that they can to make sure that their economies, and more importantly, their societies, are safe and supported, especially given the SME-heavy nature of the sector. In the Saudi tourism realm, we've been working closely with international entities such as the UN World Tourism Organization, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the World Travel and Tourism Council to better understand the needs of all parts of the sector and industry. Collaboration with these organizations gives, of course, a diverse outlook from their membership and experience. And this is the first example of multilateralism in action during the G20 tourism track. But this pandemic, of course, doesn't affect one country alone, and it cannot be solved by turning inwards. As was mentioned by Dr. Fahad, a disease knows no borders. It has no sense of flight paths or jurisdiction. The natural inclination may be for countries to focus solely domestically and to close off borders to isolate from outside threats. But in fact, there's a greater need for regional and international cooperation with the effects of COVID-19 being felt across the world and in every corner of society. Now more than ever, this crisis has demonstrated that we need a united multilateral approach. This is where the G20 steps in. The G20's focus has always been on ways to overcome crises, whether that's dealing with economic recessions, wars, and now pandemics. Through the G20, multilateralism has afforded us a wealth of tools to help address today's crisis, including access to statistics and data to help inform our decisions, as well as access to perspectives from other global experts on health and economics. In the case of travel and tourism, recovery is incredibly complex. In addition to not knowing when the sector will begin to operate again, countries are at different stages of the pandemic with different expectations, different volumes of tourists and travelers passing through during normal circumstances, and ultimately they each rely on tourism to varying degrees. Recovery of the travel sector will require a maximalist approach to multilateralism, international cooperation to ease border controls, create the right safety measures, monitor recurring waves, and support travelers across the globe is needed. In the G20 tourism track, we are focusing our efforts to collaboratively develop steps to help the industry recover with stakeholders from across the ecosystem. Great examples can be seen in the work that has already been done. In April, the G20 tourism ministers committed to working together to lift travel restrictions in a coordinated manner once it is safe to do so, as well as continuing to work together to aid in the industry in transitioning and building towards recovery. We've committed to foster innovation and digital technologies in the sector, helping to drive efficiencies and create a more seamless experience, as well as building capacities and capabilities amongst the workforce post-crisis. With our support, our partners such as the UNWTO and the WTTC are building technical assistance programs and health and safety protocols for the travel and tourism industry respectively, delivering support to countries navigating the crisis and ensuring a coordinated approach. Regional development has become particularly important as we consider that for most countries, tourism is likely to open domestically first before opening internationally. Travelers are going to be exploring closer to home, with local communities taking on a central role in creating destinations on their doorsteps. And finally, we're looking at how to retain some of the more positive outcomes of the crisis by integrating sustainability and resiliency into our tourism models, both environmentally and economically. In all, helping to map a future for tourism that is better than it was before the crisis. Tourism, like multilateralism, is a way for us to share information, cultures, and worlds, to get to know each other better and connect. Multilateralism through the G20 and across the private sector is helping to push ahead with so many of our shared objectives. It's helping us to share best practices to be more resilient, to innovate, and to adapt to a world post-COVID-19. While the system is not perfect, with challenges such as overly complex bureaucracy and politics getting in the way of action, governments must understand that we are neither in this fight alone, nor are we in competition with one another. This is a global pandemic that requires a global response. Back when I began my career at the UN, I was commuting almost 3 hours round trip for this exciting opportunity from outside of Manhattan, and the bus would drop me off right in front of the UN building to start my day looking up at this glamorous building on the East River. Over a decade later, and images of the building still evoke a strong emotion. There's something so enchanting about looking up at the big blue glass building and realizing that in its hallowed halls, there's so much knowledge and so much experience being shared to drive positive change. While multilateralism continues to evolve, for me, there have been 3 consistencies. First, the system of multilateralism as we know it must continue to adapt. The global dynamics vary greatly from the 1920s through the 1940s to today's world. Geopolitics should not overshadow the importance of multilateral cooperation or the value of international organizations that help countries navigate tumultuous times. The adaptability of governments and organizations to address today's challenges is pivotal to their continued efficacy. There's a value in working through building blocks. Global cooperation has an inherent level of trust which needs to be built in order for us to accomplish any goals. Expanding on these relationships, multilateralism relies on like-minded alliances. And so the power of sub-regional and regional platforms are important to ensure practical and tailored solutions are used to address more complex issues at the international level. And lastly, when policy building, outside voices can give really needed perspective. Other countries' experiences, as well as partner knowledge, such as the private sector, non-governmental organizations, and academia, all have valuable insight that can help governments' decision-making. It's important to step back and realize that we don't have all the answers and to gain perspective that can help us make informed decisions that can benefit our societies. Thank you once again for inviting me to take part in today's webinar. I'm very excited to listen more to the panelists presenting today. And lastly, I hope that we welcome you soon to Saudi Arabia and to see our beautiful country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for an outstanding introduction and comments from your side. We really appreciate it, and we all hope that soon this pandemic is over and people are able to travel to Saudi Arabia and to enjoy seeing more of Saudi Arabia. Some they have read about it, some they have seen part of it, but a lot they are still interested to look at the archaeology, look at the different beautiful part of Saudi Arabia. Please, if you permit me, I'll go back now to Bruno as he's going to start the policy brief and the comment from the different participants. So Bruno, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdulaziz, and thank you very much indeed to Sarah, to Dr. Fahad, and to Dr. Abdulaziz for setting the stage from the T20 perspective, from the G20 perspective. And it gives us now the chance to dive deeper into individual specific problems of the COVID-19 that are linked with our task force. And going first is Dr. Homi Kharas, who is the Interim Vice President, Director of the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. And his research focuses on global development and in particular, the G20. So we probably could not think of a better expert to kickstart our panel than Homi. So Homi, the floor is yours. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Bruno, and thank you, Dr. Abdulaziz. Thank you, Dr. Fahad, for organizing this. So I'd like to present to you a paper, a policy brief that has been jointly written with Professor Dennis Snower from the Global Solutions Initiative. Dennis is also at the Blavatnik School of Government and is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, as well as my colleague Sebastian Strauss at Brookings. In the time that's been allotted to me, I've been asked to present the main strands of our policy paper to the G20, as well as to add some remarks on how COVID might impact on multilateralism. And I'll try to do this, but to be honest, the topics overlap so considerably that I think that these two parts of my comments really just weave together and each complement the other. So let me start with the proposal to the G20. I think it's quite simple. What we suggest is that the G20 really needs to establish a working group on the future of multilateralism to develop core principles of what multilateral institutions should do as a system. I think that all of us feel that the world has in many ways lost its way with multilateralism. Of course, there are so many of us who are passionate about multilateralism and believe in multilateralism so deeply. But we do have to recognize that we are by no means the majority. And I think that now the core issue is not about differences over how to cooperate. And some people raise these questions about burden sharing issues or technical issues like whether China or other developing countries should be given preferences at the WTO. We don't think that that's really the central issue with multilateralism today. Rather, I think the central issue with multilateralism today is that we don't have an agreement on why we want to cooperate in the first place. And many large and even mid-sized powers are asking, why are multilateral institutions and initiatives better than bilateral or plurilateral, or in some cases even just national initiatives? And I think we know from Professor Danny Roderick why so many people are against multilateralism. it's because they associate it with globalization and with the subsequent loss of national sovereignty and democracy, two principles that they hold very dear. So we need to make the case for why people should be for multilateralism, and I would say for a multilateralism that is fit for the 21st century. I want to emphasize this point about the 21st century because the existing structure of multilateralism that we have today, and I'm just talking about the economic side of things, I'm not talking about the security side of things. But I would say that the backbone principle of our existing multilateral structure is do no harm. So when we set up the Bretton Woods institutions after the devastation of World War II, it was also after we had had experiences of trade wars, of competitive devaluations that made all countries worse off. And the IMF and the GATT were formed so that there could be rules on how countries should compete with each other, not just because of some sense of fairness or wanting to do things together, but because it had become quite clear that the pathways of national individualistic devaluations, of national tariffs, had led down a path essentially of mutually assured destruction. And a system was needed to set out rules that would avoid this in the future. So I think there was also a second principle, which I would loosely term do some good. And in the do some good principle, I think major economies agreed that by pooling their resources, by adopting common norms and standards, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they could improve the world to the benefit of all. And this was fundamentally the mandate of the World Bank, and later the World Bank Group and other multilateral development finance institutions, basically to encourage reconstruction, and by doing that to avoid and avert the kind of political and social developments that had, before the war led Germany and its allies to embrace fascism, National Socialism, and ultimately war, partly because of the constraints of economic development that they found themselves after as they struggled with the reparations from World War I. So our proposal doesn't try to answer the matter for the G20 of what the guiding principles for 21st century multilateralism should be, but just to say that we think that there are several issues that need to be added to these two principles of do no harm and do some good, and some principles, to be honest, that need to be subtracted if a more sustainable multilateralism is to flourish, because multilateralism has grown and evolved since those early days to embrace many other ideas. So I think foremost among the things to be added are a commitment to manage the global commons better. Right now, and initially, our multilateral institutions never really had to worry about the global commons because the footprint of man was just not so large. But today, when we see oceans, biodiversity, carbon emissions, the phosphorus and nitrogen levels, what scientists have called the Anthropocene footprint is large, it's growing, and it has to be tackled under the do no harm principle. So a second area, I think, is a commitment to what I would call global public goods and norms. Free scientific exchange, cybersecurity, bioethics, transparency, a commitment to explain to one's peers why certain choices are made, a degree of transparency on that. And at the same time, there are some aspects of multilateralism that need to be subtracted or reduced. So the principle of subsidiarity is often not respected. And quite often it's been replaced by a multilateral concept of best practice that almost shuns national experimentation. And multilateralism often is no longer seen as empowering people and creating overall well-being, but almost as if it helps to disenfranchise people and empower the state instead in a different fashion. And finally, I think we have to recognize that multilateralism has tilted too much towards efficiency and away from systemic robustness. We have individual institutions, but I think we no longer have a global operating system. And the G20 already started to recognize this and understand it when their finance ministers in Germany appointed an eminent persons group to advise on global financial governance. And what that group came up with was several recommendations about how to improve systemic stability and effectiveness. And they really illustrated and underlined the siloed nature of the current system. So what we need now is a much more ambitious working group to build a consensus on a new set of principles to guide multilateralism. I hope that as I've been speaking, some of you have been thinking about how all of this relates to the current COVID pandemic. And I have to say, I don't think that we could ask for a better illustration of the needs and defects of the current system. So let me just take a couple of minutes to recap. So COVID is first and foremost a failure of a public good, global health surveillance. We've understood the risk of a pandemic for a long time, but we've had no mechanisms to bring this to the leaders' level with the urgency required to drive action. There was a warning by CEPI, by others. There have been several global reports, but nothing that has brought this to leaders. COVID is a failure of the management of the global commons. I think many scientists have been arguing that man's incursion into wilderness and the encroachment of land use is bringing us into contact with more zoonotic diseases, making a pandemic almost inevitable. This is an issue of how we manage the global commons. Our footprint is too large to simply take nature for granted. COVID is a striking failure to understand robustness. And you just have to look at the system of public procurement of protective personal equipment and how it's breaking down. And at the same time, I think what has happened during this pandemic shows us, it warns us about what can happen and the chaos that can take place if there are no rules of the game to govern procurement. And so in this and in several other ways, I think COVID is really showing us why multilateralism has benefits. And let me just say that it has in many ways reawakened perhaps a spirit of multilateralism. We have seen an unprecedented and extraordinary degree of scientific cooperation. We've seen a real speed in the multilateral response, including coordinated fiscal and monetary actions by G20 countries on a scale that has never been seen before and that will make everyone better off, because we know that these actions, when taken in a coordinated fashion, have much more impact. We've seen that the public good of an affordable vaccine available to everyone has found really strong support in publics around the world. And that's embracement, it's an embrace of the spirit of leave no one behind. We've seen the benefits of forging all kinds of new public-private partnerships and moving multilateralism away from just a state-to-state concept to a problem-solving space. We've seen the benefit of recognizing and accepting differences in approach. I mean, when you just view how Sweden, China, continental Europe, and the United States have tried to tackle the pandemic in completely different ways that are, fitting and that work for their own particular institutions and contexts, it's clear that we have to give national experimentation ample space. And so I think this principle of subsidiarity deserves far more recognition than it's had in multilateralism as practiced today. And then I think perhaps one of the most unexpected benefits, at least to me, has been the resurgence in public trust in government. So the German public relations firm Edelman conducted a poll in a dozen or so countries quite recently, and they found that governments are again the most trusted institution in major countries, and that trust in governments has overtaken trust in business, in media, and in NGOs. And governments are again being tasked with helping people find livelihoods, health, jobs, and they will find it far harder to meet these expectations on their own. They'll need help from multilateral institutions. But the kind of help they need might be quite different from the past. And if we think about multilateralism of the 20th century as being about service delivery and all these great organizations like UNICEF and FAO, the Global Fund, all trying to deliver specific services to developing countries in particular. But I think what we're now seeing is that the multilateralism of the 21st century is really going to be about the construction of networks, the construction of knowledge exchanges that can leverage local solutions. And I think that what COVID is showing us is that we're entering an age of large problems and unknown solutions. And what we really need multilateralism for is to foster innovations, exchanges, and learning. So we are arguing for new principles for a more sustainable and inclusive world. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much for this presentation and for the insights into how we can construct new norms and find a way to make sure the provision of public goods can be ensured in the 21st century. Let me then, before we directly jump to the next speaker, to Mari Leomi, briefly kindly ask the following speakers to keep to the allocated time. And to the audience, we've seen that some questions have already been typed into the Q&A chat. If you add whom you would like to answer this question, then we can make sure it is being addressed either in writing or in the Q&A session later on. So with no further ado, the stage is yours, Marie. She's an independent researcher based in the UAE with a research interest and research focus on climate, energy policy, and environmental sustainability.
Thank you very much, Bruno. I would like to share my screen. I believe I've got the control here from you. So I hope you can all hear me and see the presentation. I'll do my best to keep it in 10 minutes. Thank you very much for the invitation to tell you about our brief and how COVID-19 has impacted the recommendations that we're making in it. In the brief, my co-authors and myself are looking at how the unique characteristics of G20 can help promote climate action and higher ambition on climate action worldwide. We identify 4 ways in which the G20 can support the UNFCCC, or the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and 2 ways in which it can engage with new actors to support higher ambition. Just as a general background, the UN estimates that in order to stay below 2 degrees of global warming, which is one of the 2 temperature goals of the Paris Agreement, we would need 2.7 annual emission reduction globally for the next decade. In order to stay below 1.5 degrees, we would need 7.6%. The IEA currently estimates that we're on track this year to have a global reduction of 8%. Under the UNFCCC, there is a process called the NDC. So these are the pledges countries make every 5 years to the UN on how much they, among other things, intend to reduce their emissions. At the moment, in order to stay below 2 degrees, we would need a 3-fold increase in ambition of these pledges. And from 1.5, we'd need a 5-fold increase. You will see on the screen the situation about 2-3 weeks ago, updated by the Climate Action Tracker, which shows in the red boxes the G20 countries that so far have indicated their plans for this year to have an update of the NDC. And this year is a critical year. This is when countries are either required or encouraged to update their NDCs. And as we see, these 6 countries have either not raised the ambition when they have re-communicated the NDC, or they're not intending to submit any new NDC. The UNFCCC still remains the central institution for global governance, as we know, but in a time of populism, isolationism, and geopolitical competition, it's demonstrating signs of inability to persuade governments to go higher. The conference in Madrid last December was an indication in point. Beyond the UNFCCC, the UN too is not able to rally countries around higher ambition. And this was demonstrated by the Secretary General's Climate Summit last September. As for the G20, they account for 80% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So there's obviously huge potential for leadership. And obviously climate change is already featured in the G20 agenda, and it suffers from many of the same ambition-related challenges than the UNFCCC. Now, looking at this policy brief topic, what we did, we first identified the value added of the G20. How could it actually help support higher ambition? And there are 3 areas in which we identified potential. First of all, there's the limited membership. The G20 lacks the democratic representation of the UNFCCC, but at the same time, it's sufficiently small and influential to be able to have a significant impact. Its low institutionalization can also be a benefit. The UNFCCC, given its role as the leading institution of the global climate regime, generally tends to end up prioritizing universality and legitimacy over speed, whereas the G20 is nimble, able to adapt its agenda and prioritize and be more action-oriented overall. However, as we know, it doesn't have really a permanent secretariat or a budget. And finally, an asset is that the G20 has a strong focus on economic issues on its agenda, whereas the UNFCCC is set up as an environmental agreement. And this has facilitated discussions in the G20 on issues where the UNFCCC has been unable to address. One good example being the fact that the Paris Agreement, if you look at it, it lacks any substantive references to energy. G20, however, has been able to address a variety of energy policy issues over the past decade or more. In our recommendations, we first make 4 recommendations that relate to how G20 could support the UNFCCC. First one relates to minilateral climate clubs. This discussion has a history in the UNCCC policy debates. These would be coalitions of the willing, and the idea would be to reduce free riding as well. The G20 could start with a subgroup of members that wish to pursue cooperation in specific areas, a bit like in the EU with the banking union and the euro. They could set common targets, harmonize their emission trading schemes, and obviously they would have members-only benefits, which could, for example, be trade-related benefits to encourage others to join. The other recommendation relates to sectoral approaches. This also has a history in the UNCCC debates, but it's been a bit of a taboo given the historical responsibility related sensitivities that are go very deep within the UNCCC. This is a way to unlock greater ambition because these trade exposed sectors generally attract the strongest concerns over competitiveness. These include autos, cement, or soybean industries, for example. And the G20 is uniquely positioned to bring these sectors together, given its large market share. These coalitions could look at things like standard setting, technology cooperation, or harmonization of regulations. There are two important signaling related functions that the G20 could adopt or strengthen. One relates to positioning itself as an informal communication forum for signaling NDC updates and finance pledges. This kind of a role would involve building trust among major emitters to aim higher. And the benefits of G20 obviously are that it's more informal than the UNCCC and obviously less binding as well. The other related recommendation is to mainstream climate change across all G20 communiques, given that climate change has implications and touches across all economic sectors, all the way from agriculture to finance, for example. A first way to engage other actor groups globally and raise ambition would be to make a subnational leaders permanent engagement group. Many of the key decisions on emissions are taken at subnational level, but they require oversight from the national level. So this kind of a group could help raise ambition, including if national leaders fail to meet global goals or uphold G20 promises. Economic size of some G20 regions outstrips that of many countries, California, the 5th largest economy, being a prime example. The other engagement idea would be to have a permanent dialogue forum with the V20, which is the vulnerable 20 group of ministers of finance. It's a high-level policy dialogue of about 50 highly climate vulnerable countries. Here, there have been ad hoc meetings in the past, and the challenge here that this would address would be the fact that the lack of inclusion of those most severely impacted by climate change raises a legitimacy concern for the G20. I'll elaborate on this a little bit more on the next slide, which is my final slide. Now, how does COVID-19 interfere? How does it impact, or does it make our recommendations less or more urgent? The short answer is, when it comes to climate clubs, these are still the major emitters, 80% of global emissions. Climate clubs definitely would be something to look into. Trade exposed sectors now require even closer attention to avoid a so-called brown recovery, if you're familiar with the green recovery debates. There was a study last month from Oxford University that calculated that out of the $7.3 trillion already earmarked or agreed as fiscal rescue measures by G20 countries, only 4% could be described as green, resulting in green growth. So there's an urgent challenge to address here through coordination. With the postponement of the next major climate summit by potentially up to a year to November 2021, whilst at the same time the Paris Agreement decision from 2015 requiring and inviting countries to submit their NDC updates in the calendar year of 2020, there is a crucial role for the G20 to play here as a forum for communicating these new pledges. And preempting a question from the audience, I should note that the G20 summit possibly conveniently takes place after the US elections this year. Mainstreaming climate change remains equally important, and supporting subnational leaders is also of heightened importance, as national governments put together recovery, stimulus, bailout, rescue packages. Doing these together with the city level, which is where many of the green solutions relating to food, mobility, and so forth will take place, this would be increasingly important. And finally, as we know, the vulnerable countries, economically also the vulnerable countries to climate change. And what the most vulnerable countries in the world now need is fiscal space. Last month, the G20 announced a debt repayment moratorium for 76 of the poorest countries, and there's been some discussion on debt relief. The moratorium came with conditionalities, and we think that having a dialogue with a forum like the T20 would benefit in co-designing any future conditionalities to ensure that these countries' interests are taken into account and any recovery could be as green as possible. So in sum, our recommendations, if you look at the arrows, are either still relevant or their urgency has simply increased as a result of COVID-19. I look forward to your questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mary, for this very interesting presentation. I would just ask you to stop sharing your screen so I can go back and share mine. Thank you very much for this presentation. I think it's certainly a very timely intervention to also remind us that we need to think energy, economic, and environmental policy together. Here, the UNFCCC and the G20 to allow for effective policy making in this field. So I hope we can discuss this further during the Q&A. Next in line is Dr. Hans Born, who is the Assistant Director and Head of Research and Policy at the Research Division at the Geneva Center for Security Sector Reform, the DCAF, and therefore his research interests lie in the security sector governance and security sector reform. Hans, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bruno. First of all, I would like to thank all of you, particularly the host, Dr. Abdulaziz Saga's chair of this task force, but also you, Bruno, and co-chairs for hosting this very timely webinar. So greetings to all of you from Geneva, and being in the land of chocolate, Alps, but also the clocks. I will stick to the time. So, and if I understand, recall correctly, I will use around 10 minutes and then as to give as much possible time for the discussion. So, so I was asked, first of all, to say a little bit about the policy briefs, which we have called between development and fragility. And then I turn to the impact of COVID-19. So first of all, how we have framed our policy brief is that we see that the future of multilateralism, global governance, rests on the realization of two very important agendas which are adopted at the international level and to which states are committed. And these are the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustaining Peace Agenda. Those two we see as crucial for further cementing and enforcing strengthening the multilateral framework. So if we look a little bit closer to this, however, we see that the implementation of the 2030 Agenda is not as expected and the challenges are tremendous. The progress is slow. And as agreed by the UN and also by the World Bank, that conflict, violence, and fragility are seen as the major obstacles to achieving sustainable development. So to say in very simple words, that countries which are plagued by fragility, conflict, and violence, and will in turn be affected by growing inequalities, grievances, and fueled by perceptions of injustice and lack of opportunity for work, etc. So we see then fragility and violence and conflict as the main obstacles to achieving development, sustainable development, which in turn is crucial for multilateralism to succeed. So if we also, when we were in Saudi Arabia and Riyadh in, I think it was in January, when we were still all able to travel, and we saw all of us there in that beautiful research center, many of us spoke about the access to clean water, to health, to medicines. And it was also said that if states are in conflict and violence, we can all forget about that. So therefore, it would be crucial for any multilateral approach to reinforcing development and strengthening multilateralism, that addressing fragility should be in the toolbox of any multilateral approaches, and it also applies to the G20. So one of the main responses to addressing fragility, conflict, and violence is the provision of security in countries without discrimination, security for all, that no one is left behind, and on the principles of good governance, accountability, and the rule of law. So this is actually how we have actually framed this, and with this in the background, we think it will be essential that the G20 and, or more closer to home, the T20 should support a governance-driven approach to security. So that means like not only hard security, but security that is delivered to all states, communities, and its individuals by the principles of good governance. That would be crucial. That would be a first thing. And it would be, as I said, as fragility, conflict, and violence is essential, that will be managed in order to achieve development. That would be absolutely should be a first priority. But we should not deal with security sector governance and reform in isolation. We should always see it in a wider context of public sector reform. So this should be interconnected. So if we are building a new school system and education without paying attention to security and safety, all these building up efforts are all in vain. And this is something that we have seen in the past in the reconstruction of Afghanistan, for example. And this also applies to other sectors, and vice versa. If we think we can only build up a strong security sector without having an eye whether the people trust the government, whether people are involved in decision making, would also make no sense. The security sector alone cannot drive this. It should be therefore be put in a wider context of public sector reform. So this would be, from my point of view, what I would like to say about the policy brief. And now I say a few words about how COVID-19 impacts on this. So I think, first of all, we all know that, but it cannot harm to restate that COVID-19 is foremost a health crisis. And that means like health authorities should be in charge. They should provide our leaders with expert advice on how to proceed. And in turn, this health crisis can have knock-on effects and secondary effects on other areas. It can lead to, for example, more poverty, education can be in disarray, as we have seen, and also here security come into play. And I will say a little bit more about that, how that is involved. So the security sector is often by many states deployed as one of the first responder in times of emergency. And many states have, due to the health crisis, triggered a state of emergency, which would then give powers, for example, to enforce a lockdown, that people cannot leave the houses without a valid reason or only for very specific reasons. And as we see in our country, this would need all to be enforced, and therefore the security sector comes therefore in play. And but we see that the pandemic puts it all under pressure, and that we see that many states actually are grappling and struggling with, at the same time, providing effective security, but which is also democratically governed and accountable. So this is actually what we see. And then I have two key messages on this, and then I stop. The first one is that security providers are called into action to provide responsibilities which are outside their normal role. So we see in many countries they are asked to help with logistics with hospitals, to set up hospitals, to do the airport, the air transport capacity is used for bringing in protective equipment. All these roles come into play. And at the same time, their normal tasks are a little bit going to the background, or they cannot fulfill them. So in some countries, we have seen the recruitment centers have been closed down, no military education takes place, or exercises are cancelled. So we see that has also a big impact. And the lack of protective equipment also in some countries has led to the situation that the police, for example, who's there to look that these rules are respected, if they are not properly protected, they are becoming themselves the ones who spread the COVID-19, which has happened in some countries as well. So the first key message is they have to fulfill responsibilities to security sector providers, such as the armed forces, the police, etc., with roles that they normally don't do. And then my second key observation, which is actually the most important one, I would say. So while the security providers are endowed with greater powers, more powers at the state level, at the same time, we see that the overseers, those who are supposed to oversee the security sector, and those are which are the parliament, civil society organizations, independent oversight bodies, they have less powers to do so. In many countries, parliaments are not functioning as normal, their sessions are decreased, if at all, they are trying to move to online sessions, so it's not easy for them to deal with that. And in other countries where people can, the oversight bodies where people can complain. Hello? Hello?
Yes, I can still hear you. Hans? Okay, it seems he lost the connection. Perhaps we then jump to the next presentation. Yeah, my apologies for these problems with the connections. We did not anticipate that, and neither can we control it. Regardless, I think it was interesting that he mentioned the difficulties to reform the security sector without integrating it into a broader public sector reform, and also to show how a leading institute like his actually thinks about the role of security and how this perception can change, or how this definition is challenged in times of COVID-19. I suggest we now turn to the next panelist, who is Julia Pomares, and she's the Executive Director at the Center for the Implementation of Public Policies Promoting Equity and Growth, CPEC in Buenos Aires. And she is the co-chair of this task force as well, in addition with Nathalie Tocci and Helmut Anheier, the three co-chairs of this task force. So with no further ado, Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bruno, and thank you to all. As you can see in my screen, the light of a nice sunny Buenos Aires. It's great to be here. Let me start by the impact of COVID on our topic that we think it's quite important, and then get into some of the recommendations of the policy brief that we jointly worked with Andres Ortega and Glenn Abdallah. I think they are both there this morning. So I will start by telling you that one night of insomnia during these quarantine times, I woke up dreaming that there was a time machine in the balcony of my house. And it's true. I didn't remember. It's true that it was a dream. Unfortunately, there was not a time machine in the balcony of my house. And I couldn't remember where I was heading to, or if it transported me to the past or to the future. But I enjoyed imagining, and that's what I want to share with you today, is that where I was going and what I learned from that. And I imagine traveling to the future. And there were two questions that I would like to ask the machine. The first one is that, was COVID the first in a series of intermittent pandemics that we became used to live with? And the second, which of the many traits that we are seeing that seem unique to this pandemic are going to survive? Which is the most important trait of this pandemic? I am a political scientist, so I cannot rehearse any answer to the first questions, just worry about the consequences that new normal would have. But there is one aspect of COVID that I venture, and is that the fact that this pandemic coincided with a historic moment of transformation of global capitalism, as Carles Boyce named it, from the Detroit capitalism to the Silicon Valley model. So I imagine that 2020 will remain in the history books as the end of the transition to this intangible economy of data and AI. So living in the cloud, or more precisely, the digitalization of the economy and therefore of society, is a process that has been going on for a few decades now, but we know that it will be accelerated by the arrival of COVID. So the main issue here is that while many of the consequences of this type of capitalism for the future of work are already clear, we know a lot now about the impact of automation. I think that this virus found us in the dark about how institutions will be and how should be transformed both domestically and globally. So we have the temptation that because we know that there is an exponential growth of digital transformation, that we think that we're going to have exponential changes in post-COVID institutions. But I think it's too early to guess, and I think we need to be clear that although we could have a crisis as opportunity mantra, we can also have a not every crisis is a turning point mantra to prevail. So because I woke up and I don't have a time machine in my balcony, I want to speculate about some impacts of this COVID. And I would like to think it as whether it's an accelerator, whether it's a break or a stop, or whether it's a change, of course, in the trends in global governance that we already know that are in place. So there are 4 important trends for AI regulation that I want to highlight today with you. The first one is that although we know that this pandemic showed something that probably seemed unthinkable some months ago, that most governments, whether democratic or not, whether in the North or in the South, share a common value that putting human life above the immediate economic effect, but it was not enough to result in greater coordination between national governments. But we did witness something that is very important for our topic, that is a very high level of coordination among non-state entities, not only the scientific community, but also cooperation between private corporations. So I think that is a distinctive feature of this pandemic. For example, the joint action between Google and Apple for the tracing apps. So that is a first trend. The second trend that I think it's important for our topic is that concentration of economic power in large technology companies and the relative loss of share of small and medium-sized enterprises. And that is also being accelerated by COVID. So we might not know when we are going to get a vaccine, but we do know that governments will have to negotiate with powerful players in the marketplace. A third trend is the increase in social inequalities and regional disparities. COVID seems to be an accelerator of inequality, probably too early to tell. But if the economic depression is not quickly reversed, it's probably what we are going to see. So if regional disparities will grow, we think, or I think, the role of global AI regulation is still more crucial. And the last, fourth trend probably is a natural corollary of the previous ones. We have seen in recent years the deterioration of the liberal component of democracies and a resurgence of nationalism. So against this background, the potential application of AI to improve accountability and transparency would be of utmost importance. So because of these 4 trends, this policy brief that we wrote on managing the transition to a multi-stakeholder AI governance, I think it's very timely, and that is the focus of our policy brief. There are 4 important recommendations that I want to highlight today about our policy brief. The first one is how we define the subject of the regulations. A first important practical aspect is how we determine which systems should be subject to recommendations and procedures, rules, policy, and actions. And we think that the first recommendations is especially for the G20, because the G20 is the best platform to discuss and foster the agreements to push this agenda forward. We envision that the G20 can become a reservoir for AI knowledge and implementation by sharing the best practices to guide technical innovation, and also by developing new policy approaches to deal with common concerns. The second recommendation is that we think that we are just at the moment of moving beyond ethical principles. We know that we already have ethical principles of AI, and we need to move to standards. So that is, we think, the next step for AI regulation, and it should be put into practice as far as possible with all this acceleration of COVID. The third recommendation is about how we map the agents, the scope, and the power structures involved in the governance of AI. Any form of governance, we know, requires a clear set of agents and bodies responsible for its implementation. There is here a trade-off whether we need to create new specialized agencies or take the ones that we already have in place. Here we think and we argue that there are already international standard bodies that have a track record of governing social technical issues and have the institutional capacity to do that, for example, ISO or ITU. And the final recommendation, the fourth one, is about how to ensure accountability and foster legitimacy. And we think here that there is a key aspect of the AI regulation about adopting clear procedures and make the information publicly available, allowing the public to meaningfully assess how systems should be used and how they should be collected, used, storage, and share the personal information, especially in a context where these tracing apps and many other apps are going to increase in the following months. So let me finish by saying that we truly believe that the role of the T20 in aligning interest and leading such processes will be key to push forward and to spread standards. And I would love to have a DeLorean in my balcony to travel me to the future and tell you if it became real, but I hope it does. And thank you very much. And we hopefully have some time for discussion with you, together with Belen, Abdallah, and Andres Ortega. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for this very interesting presentation. And yeah, the idea of a time machine would be certainly a very, very interesting and potentially disruptive innovation to go forward. And yeah, particularly for the discussion, I think it's very interesting to look at the impact of COVID-19 on the transformation of the economy, or the further transformation of the economies, and the role of the so-called Corona apps, COVID-19 apps, to track contact tracing in the population. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion on these issues in the Q&A session. Again, as a reminder, please feel free to just write your messages into the Q&A chat, and we're going to discuss them after we've finished the remaining presentations, which is, yeah, the bridge to the presentation of Policy Brief, the second part of this panel, of this presentation, of this webinar. We're just slightly behind with the time, so please make sure you stick to the allocated 4 minutes in your presentations. And with no further ado, I'm going to give the stage to Ronja and Hugo.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Hugo and I decided that I will go first and then hand over the word to him. Welcome to everyone, and thank you very much for all the presentation. I think it was great to see how many different sectors we work with in this very working group. Hugo and I in our paper nevertheless address one of the more horizontal and cross-cutting issues. And the challenge that we found is, I guess, very close to what all the others saw, but we were struck by this paradox that on the one hand, we have those mounting global governance challenges. COVID is just one expression of the very many that we're seeing on the one hand, and on the other hand, growing nationalist sentiments and a lack of trust in multilateral organization when we in fact would need them the most. So our proposal to address this gap for the G20 would be to invest more in rethinking and also reinforcing the use of multi-stakeholder arrangements to close the gap. We define multi-stakeholder arrangement as two or more classes of actors, state and non-state, usually engaged in a common global governance exercise. Because this way we could, on the one hand, address the global challenges more effectively, so the demand side in a way, and then also restore trust in the problem-solving capacities of multilateral organizations, just such as the G20, but also others. 2 sentences of background. We believe that the G20 has a pretty good track record in reaching out to non-state actors, not least in the shape of these engagement groups, that one of which we represent. But we also find that one problem is there has not been a coherent set of principles on how to use these engagement groups as the T20, the B20, the C20, and so on and so forth. There's also no timetable or structure how input from these engagement groups can feed into policy making, policy shaping processes at the leaders level of the G20. And secondly, one of the problems also is that the role of the engagement groups has been restricted to like mere consultation processes. So there is an advocacy function, but this is only a very small part of the policy making cycle that the G20 should address. So this is where we started from. And based on these observations, we came up with 3 concrete proposals. And the first one refers to this consultative function. So we're not saying it's not important, but it's only one part of the story. But our first recommendation is to take consultative processes very seriously. We recommend an initial audit of the existing engagement groups and consulting functions in order to enhance existing platforms, to potentially eliminate duplications that exist, but also maybe to create new engagement groups where they are deemed necessary. Secondly, we would recommend the G20 to consider the creation of multi-sectoral task and finish groups, so very issue-specific groups that could tackle a problem such as the COVID-19 crisis, that draw on the expertise of people from civil society, from businesses, from states, from international organizations, and so on. And thirdly, to take these consultative processes seriously, we really would urge the leaders or the Leaders Summit in November to firewall some dedicated space on the agenda to include the voices and the opinions from all the engagement groups in order to listen out to what non-state actors, what other experts in their fields have to say, and to integrate this in their decision-making processes. We have 2 more proposals, but for these, I'll turn it over to Hugo. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thanks, Ronya, and thanks for a seamless transition there, I think. Our second recommendation comes under the umbrella term of considering the whole of the policy cycle and creating supporting structures. So non-state actors taking part in the consultative processes have tended to play an agenda setting function, which is only one role that they could play. We ask that other potential roles are taken into account as part of these engagement processes. So it could be as service providers, filling the gaps of under-resourced governments, could be playing a role in capacity building and knowledge transfer. It could be in setting norms, setting standards. We need to take into account the whole range of various activities that these non-state actors can play. However, we live in a state-centric world. So we need G20 governments to create some kind of platform and really animate that platform to try and leverage these roles of non-state actors. And one such platform, we think, could be a modest, light touch G20 secretariat. Now we know that this can be a controversial subject, but we stress the words modest and light touch. This secretariat could manage logistics for future summits, ensuring continuity in the engagement groups. It could facilitate greater interaction between the engagement groups. It could be a docking station for non-state actors involved in G20 initiatives, and it could serve as a repository where key documents and information on compliance reports and so on could be stored. If you're looking for a central home for this light touch secretariat, a non-G20 country like Singapore has played an active role, a leadership role in the global governance group could be appropriate. Or if we want to form a leader to personify this, well, personally, I would highlight Gordon Brown as a potential individual who could play that role. Now, as we say, this is controversial. It wasn't so controversial for our reviewers who seemed to take the proposal on board. But we feel that the G20 is possibly going to be damaged in the future if it doesn't take on this kind of role. A good analogy that has been coined by two of my colleagues at Sheffield, Tony Payne and Matthew Bishop, is that the G20 is in danger of becoming a rental car without this kind of secretariat. In that a government will take out the rental car, take out the G20 for a year, use it in whichever way it wants, return it at the end of the year. No one really checks if any damage has been done before it's rented out to another driver. Number 3, our final recommendation is under the general umbrella term of think multi-stakeholder and act multi-stakeholder. And essentially this is an exercise in empathy. We want to see consideration of multi-stakeholder engagement from the various stakeholders' perspectives. And just a few examples of how this can be done. Language can create an unconscious barrier to meaningful interaction. So the G20 could review its various membership statuses. It has guests, it has permanent guests, it has permanent observers, but this creates a certain hierarchy. And it's always the emphasis is on these civil society groups, these non-state actors, to find a way into the G20 agenda. They have to speak the language of the G20 rather than the other way around. Quantitatively, we think the number of recommendations and documentation that comes out of engagement groups could be reduced. And I think this would be a lesson for the G20 as well. Last year at the G7 in France, we saw a very brief one-page executive summary of discussions issued, and we think that brevity is a virtue. And finally, we recommend that the G20 consider the flexible use of social compacts to create a non-legal binding multi-stakeholder agreement that ties together governments and relevant non-state actors to create relationships built on confidence. Where we are with this brief is that we have received some excellent feedback. We've taken that on board, and this brief is hot off the press from the 14th of May, just last week. So we'll welcome any further feedback. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your presentations. So next in line is Maha Akil. And just as another reminder, please everyone try to keep to the allocated time. Otherwise, we might not be able to reach the Q&A, or I will just have to play the bad cop and interrupt you at some point. So Maha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bruno. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good to see you all, at least virtually. I'll be brief, sticking to your warning, Bruno. My paper or policy brief is titled Aligning Internal Approaches with World Developments for Tackling Global Challenges. And from the feedback that I've already received, that there were some comments about the title. The idea of the title is for the G20 to be inclusive when forming a process to tackle a global challenge that takes into consideration world developments. So I'm already working on changing the title for that. Just briefly from the abstract, my policy brief. People need an international system to address security of many kinds and global challenges, but internal disputes or conflict of interest among the member states have hampered on many occasions an active or desired response. So this policy brief will address these challenges and suggest ways for the G20 to be more effective and dynamic by having mechanisms for engaging and coordinating with relevant international and regional organizations and local stakeholders. What I'm proposing is for the G20 to form steering committees to address specific challenges, whether it's poverty, climate change, or diseases such as the COVID-19, or to actually reform an international organization, as we're hearing right now, a lot of talks about reforming the WHO and other organizations. The steering committees would set target goals, monitoring mechanisms, accountability, and transparency. Again, from the feedbacks that I received, that it could be another layer of bureaucracy. My view that it is not another layer of bureaucracy. It is a coordination bureau between the existing working groups. It does not need to have a physical office or additional staff. An online platform and virtual meetings are enough, as we're having right now. Everything now is virtual meetings. The value added of the steering committee is that it ensures transparency, coordination, accountability, guidance, and diversity. There are many regional and international organizations, as well as private foundations, think tanks, civil society that are working on the same global issues, such as diseases, terrorism, climate change. The G20 itself is another international organization that was created to address socioeconomic challenges. However, each of them has its own strengths and competitive advantage, but it also has their limitations and weaknesses. And they face almost the same obstacles, including financial, national sovereignty, and the dominance of some states. The objective of the steering committee is to change the approach to decision-making and the channels of communication by cutting down on the layers of bureaucracy and the decision-making process through strengthening cooperation and coordination between the different stakeholders, having better allocation of resources, more flexible process, and monitoring of the progress. The paper proposes for the G20 to form, like I said, steering committee that brings together representatives of international organizations, as well as member states, NGOs, and think tanks to tackle specific challenges. The steering committee will set target goals, like I said, the monitoring mechanism, accountability, and transparency. Some of the main aspects of the steering committee is that it ensures representation. So it does not stick to only the G20 members, but it could also include other relevant or concerned states. Therefore, this ensures inclusivity. It also needs to be effective in the sense of transparency and accountability when performing their tasks and mandates and assigning responsibility. A governance system in which the in terms of establishing policies and means of monitoring implementation by the steering committee members in order to evaluate the progress made, readjust the process if necessary, and report back regularly to the leaders of the G20. And it allows for forming coalitions. The steering committee should be able to seek the cooperation of other bodies, especially regional organizations and civil society, if and when required. Taking the example of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was an immediate need for the leaders of the G20 to meet and make decisions and take actions. Saudi Arabia, as chair, made the decision to call for an emergency virtual meeting. It invited the WHO as the main organization relevant to this crisis, which is exactly in line with my proposal, that depending on the issue at hand, to involve the relevant international and regional organizations in the decision-making. It also invited financial organizations because funding is always pertinent to implementation. And it invited the ILO and the OECD because of the economic aspects of the crisis. Each of these invited organizations were tasked with specific mandates, which they are expected to report on regularly. So this is almost the structure of the proposed steering committee, but instead of being reactive in response to an emergency, the proposal asks that such steering committees are set up in anticipation of and proactive in addressing a crisis before it becomes an emergency. Furthermore, in our proposal, the invited organizations who are members of the steering committee to tackle the coronavirus pandemic would not only coordinate with concerned national and local organizations, for example, the WHO would coordinate with health ministries and pharmaceutical companies and research centers, but they will also meet together as members of the steering committee, the WHO, the ILO, the OECD, the WBG, and other relevant international organizations to update and coordinate their initiatives and actions. So basically, this is a very brief summary, and I don't know if I went too fast, but this is basically it.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this insightful presentation. Next, I would like to ask Daniele Fatibene to present on behalf of his research group on their policy paper.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for the invitation and for organizing. I will be very brief, so we will have time for the Q&A and the reflections with the group. Thanks a lot also for your feedbacks that we have collected and we are working on. Our policy brief was a very interesting attempt to bridge and connect people from different latitudes and with different sensitiveness towards the topic of multilateralism, from Bonn to South Africa. We started our analysis by considering, as you all highlighted in your presentations, that multilateralism is at stake, and it risks to bring and to lead to major problems, especially in the most fragile regions and countries of the world. So in this context of fragile multilateralism and decreasing legitimacy of multilateral systems, we wanted to address the issue of African legitimacy in some multilateral fora as G20 and try to see how this legitimacy could be increased in order to increase the image and improve the image of some multilateral fora among key African partners, and also to provide more tailored and more effective solutions to the current situation. As you very much well highlighted, the COVID-19 pandemics will have huge consequences, especially in the very fragile situations and countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So it is crucial that current multilateral settings provide effective and important solutions to those countries that may see in this fora solution as an effective system to handle these problems and to leave no one behind. So through the reflection in the group, we identified informal dialogues on reforms, multilateralism, a system that could be channeled through the G20 to increase and to identify solutions to increase African legitimacy in the group, since nowadays only South Africa is member of the grouping, and to tailor solutions that could both face current challenges and increase the long-term capacity of the grouping to respond to fragilities and crises. And this is even more crucial today when the US-China divide at the global level risks to undermining the capacity of these groupings to address these challenges and to provide solutions. So we identified as a potential way out and as a potential element to better explore as researchers to invest more in other new actors that could still keep the legitimacy of the G20, but at the same time identify new solutions to better represent African agency in this grouping. So we drawing on the long experience and long history and of relations ranging from trade to environment to other topics between European and African countries, we identified as a potential element sort of EU-Africa caucus in the G20 as a way to improve the whole grouping capacity to respond to crisis, and at the same time to increase its visibility and legitimacy among new potential newcomers or from Africa. And then we identified with our colleagues from DIE and SAIA informal dialogues in the G20 as a way to spur dialogue, to boost mutual trust, and at the same time to identify potential elements and suggestions for the whole grouping to provide more tailored solution. Now we are in the process of revising the policy brief because sorry, I muted my mic, because of course it is important that this effort is not just an EU-African one, but it's a whole G20 exercise. But the idea is that in a context where multilateralism is at stake and where major partners and risk to be less interested in using this fora as a potential solutions, actors like European countries and new, more supported African agency could be of help for keeping multilateralism as the best way to reply not only to the pandemics, but also to the social and economic marginalization that risks to be very, very negative and dramatic for the most fragile countries in the world.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for this enlightening presentation of your policy brief and the relationship between African and European actors in this regard. Now I would like to ask Shafi Aldama to give the presentation on behalf of his policy brief and on behalf of his colleagues.
Sure, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. As you know, I would like to be very brief because of the time limit, as I can see by my watch so far. But our policy paper is on international political economy and the future of multilateralism. In particular, it's in the World Fund and the future of the G20. As you all know, that the G20, since its creation, has been doing a great job in solving so many issues in the world economic and in making, let's say, political stability, especially in the last 12 years when the leaders started to have a yearly summit. Yet, the G20 is lacking in the area. In Bahrain, we do have a very well-known well for water, actually, that is irrigating faraway farms, but never irrigate its surrounding. And in our case, especially in regard to the integration between the G20 members, this is very typical for the G20. So our proposal come in where we do believe that a special kind of instrument can be proposed in order to strengthening the, let's say, the mutual interest between the states and also the economic integration. Well, they're doing fine in regard to the trade, but everyone or every member of the G20 is working in its own regional or economic bloc, but among them or among themselves, it's a bit lacking. So we do believe that there are so many instruments. One of it is what we are proposing here, that the G20 do have a sovereign wealth fund now, or today we have on the country that are with Australia, China, India, Italy, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Turkey, United States of America and Canada. They do have a sovereign wealth fund at the sub-state level. Other members are following suit. The phenomena is very new and it's going on rapidly. And we do believe this is the right time to let those countries think of putting all these resources together in order to increase wealth, to develop a key economic sector, and to strengthen, of course, their economic integration and their political tie. Such a proposal is possible because some of these countries did take some action that is within what we are proposing today. For example, in October 2018, the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund joined the Russian and the Chinese in a joint Russian Chinese investment fund, which is functioning well up to the date. The proposal is with you. I don't want to go through the detail, but I would like to come to the recommendation. The paper, without neglecting, of course, the already established principles such as the Santiago Principle and the G20 guiding principle for global investment and policy making, is recommending the creation of a framework for a working group that can provide opportunity for collaboration between the G20 state sovereign wealth fund. Such a framework should allow for long-term cooperation, direct investment, and the formation of bilateral, trilateral, and multilateral investment. Obviously, this ultimately would encourage the G20 state to strengthen their economic integration, their mutual interest, and will surely improve multilateralism and enhance the development and the growth of certain critical sector. Above that, we do believe that such an instrument will be very vital to be used in a world or global crisis, such as the existing or the current COVID-19. Those states could use their sovereign wealth fund in a collective way. I mean, now everyone is using it individually, and of course, it's an opportunity for some of them to go for, let's say, a good investment, but we do believe that it could be even more than that if they can put their forces together. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this concise presentation. Now we're turning to Dr. Thorsten Jelinek and his presentation of the Policy Brief Coordinating Committee for the Governance of Artificial Intelligence.
Thank you, Bruno. And Mr. Chairman, co-chairs, and colleagues, I'm also very thankful for the feedback we have received. And I, as proposed by Bruno, I prepared a few slides which should help me to stick to the 4 minutes. In a way, it felt briefly a little bit out of time, the AI topic. But I think COVID is mainly accelerating history. And although AI currently is a little bit less vocal, I think it will pick up again. And technologically, I think this is an inevitable trend we're facing. And our proposal basically is to set up a coordinating committee for the governments of AI. And the challenge here is that AI, and I don't want to spend too much here, has these unprecedented risks, even though they are not as immediate as the current health challenge. They might come up, and these risks are more immediate cyber-physical risks. And what maybe we're here more concerned is the longer-term structural risks we could face. This is the first one. Then we see a proliferation of AI ethics governance frameworks, meaning approaches which kind of seek to deal with this topic. At the same time, the cyber regime, so all these organizations, multilateral organizations, countries and regions dealing with this topic, this is very fragmented. You could say there is a police-centric, bottom-up approach, which is true, kind of a network approach. But if you look more from the attempt to, or the need to internationally coordinate the AI challenge, it appears very fragmented. This fragmentation, as part of the challenge we see, is caused, of course, by fierce competition over the technology itself. We are having a strong cultural and systemic differences, which make a so far coordinated approach difficult, and it will keep it difficult. Of course, we have geopolitical frictions and an anti-globalism sentiment, which, as the speakers before have highlighted, undermines the sense of a more centralized coordination and multilateral structure which could deal with it. So the challenge here, obviously, there's a lack of international coordination for the governance of AI. And maybe according to the current backdrop, we also feel even a higher urgency, as we do not want to wait until the next crisis emerges, and the G20 usually is a good place to tackle crisis, even though the current one, it is a bit more handicapped. We propose basically a mechanism for the G20, and there's a novelty, because such a permanence usually does not exist, or such an institutionalization usually does not exist on the G20 level. And we are very much aware of it. But for now, we see here the G20 as a kind of a meta governor with 4 institutional features we deem important. One, of course, the obvious one is a comprehensive coordination between the tasks and outcomes. The speaker before has mentioned the engagement groups, but of course also including not only the G20 member states, but also the main actors of the existing multilateral order, the organizations, notably, of course, the United Nations and other organizations which deal with the AI governance challenge already. The second institutional features we propose is or are accountable procedures. AI, a coordinating committee for AI requires, because of the centralization, a more transparent, rules-based, justifiable, and even sanctionable procedures. Very importantly, this is not just geared towards a universal agreements, but especially to tolerate and manage ambiguity and conflict. Because of the existing different views and frictions, there needs to be a mechanism to respect those differences, especially on a systemic level in this space. Otherwise, the willingness to talk and collaborate is very difficult, also on the G20 level. Another very...
If I may briefly interrupt, I'm very sorry. I'm just saying we're running out of time. So if I may ask you to briefly jump to the concluding remarks in order for us to cover all the ground that we still need to cover in this webinar. Thank you very much. I'm very sorry.
No, that's fair enough. So maybe just why we think the G20 here is best suited. This requires centralization. We have, the G20 has its sovereign powers. It is known for international policy design, so it has a strength, but it underutilizes this strength for global stewardship. The informality is good, but actually a coordinating body would actually increase the legitimacy and transparency of the G20 itself. And the G20 is already dealing with the AI topic or with the digitalization topic. It has adopted the AI principles. It runs the G20 repository and digital policies and digital roundtables. And so we believe here that the G20 is well suited, but we are very much aware, and thank you for the feedback, that such institutionalization means, in the best case, some kind of reform for this topic itself. Thank you. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for your presentation. May I just ask you to stop sharing your screen so I can quickly share mine again?
I'll do quickly. Here we go.
Thank you very much. And now the final policy brief in our presentation today by Mario Torres and Sean Riordan. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. We started from a discussion about whether international law applies in cyberspace and whether there are norms of behavior that are generally and broadly agreed in cyberspace. And from that, we drew the conclusion that a problem is not whether international law applies in cyberspace, but what it means if it does. The adaptation of various provisions in international law, like what does neutrality mean, what does armed conflict mean, as well as a whole series of problems that don't exist in physical space and therefore not covered by international law, like attribution of attacks, whether responses should be maintained only in cyberspace or whether you can respond to an attack in cyberspace, in physical space, a whole range of issues which the lack of norms of behavior, the lack of rules of the game, if you like, are creating considerable instability because nobody quite knows where the red lines in behavior are, what constitutes acceptable or unacceptable behavior. And so we wanted to look at how you could develop these norms. And our thinking was, rather than having big conferences which then adopt statements or adopt big conventions, which is perhaps the way that things were done in the past, we need to start looking for more bottom-up solutions based around shared preferred outcomes among smaller groups of state and non-state actors, and then building out from there, possibly even using blockchain technologies to record agreements as they're made. And so our recommendation for the G20 is that, first of all, it should develop or should create a workshop or a working group to explore how we could develop an effective cyber diplomacy or an effective diplomacy for helping establish norms and rules of behavior in cyberspace. And secondly, that it could develop platforms of where state and non-state actors can come together to start sharing their views on what these norms should look like, and doing so on the basis of what are their preferred outcomes in cyberspace. And then I think perhaps the final point, why G20 rather than other bodies? With the UN, as with artificial intelligence, the UN has come up with proposals for bodies, a group of government experts, for example, to consider these issues. But these bodies tend, first of all, to be very government-driven, whereas behavior in cyberspace is as much about non-state actors as state actors. But also, they tend inevitably to be dominated by the Permanent Five and the Security Council, and all the tensions and disagreements among them. And we felt that if the G20 were to take the lead in this, it would be a more neutral and more effective platform for taking the debates forward. I'll stop there.
Excellent, Sean. Thank you very much for this concise presentation. That was very interesting, and you very much stick to the time. Thank you for this. We are very short on time for the Q&A, unfortunately. I would like to take the time, though, and ask one question that I can see that is still not answered in the Q&A chat by Gaurav Sharma. And the question is directed to Hans Born. And the question is, how do you prioritize the setting of fragility, violence, and conflicts is made to work in the G20 framework when current multilateral programs, whether it's UNICEF, FAO, WFO, etc., are running out of resources and financial assisting in areas such as Yemen and South Sudan, where the state of health systems are already broken down? What is the role of the SSR, and how can it be intertwined with SDGs such as SDG 1, 2, and 4? I'll give you 1 minute for the answer, Hans, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And also thank you that you mentioned that this question was raised, because my Zoom crashed, so I didn't see it at all. So, I think, unfortunately, that sustainable development, including all the goals, its realization will be in jeopardy if states are in conflict and are affected by violence. So we can prioritize other areas, but if a country is not in peace and and free from violence, then it will be quite futile to work on these other things. I think, as I've mentioned, this should be done in tandem. So I think it would be totally wrong to focus in this fragile situation only on security. I think security sector reform is part of public sector reform, and it should be done hand in hand. So, and what comes first in what country? I think this would depend on the particular context. I would like also to add that those countries which are sort of in conflict and where peace processes are ongoing, it would be vital that in those peace agreements that one also discusses how in implementation of peace agreements the security sector is organized or reorganized. So that is what I would like to say. And about these particular SDGs that you mentioned, if you look at the entire 2030 agenda, there are around 60 targets which are related to peace and security. So while security as such is not coined in the 2030 agenda, there are these 60 or so targets which really have these links to ending violence, and therefore some sort of security is necessary. So I hope that answers your question.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this comprehensive answer. And I'm very sorry that we do not have time for any other questions, that we're just running out of time now. Of course, if you have any other question that you would like to see answered, please feel free to just send me an email or reach out directly to the speaker that you would like to engage with. And I'm sure we can continue this discussion in writing after this meeting will be concluded. So let me take this opportunity and thank you everyone, the task force, the guests, and of course our audience to joining us today. And looking forward, this is the final slide to share with you. As you can see, we are currently here on the block of the COVID-19 webinar series that the Secretariat and T20 is currently arranging. And the important next steps for everyone here are particularly the 14 June deadline, which is the deadline for our policy briefs, the second draft, and the very same day, or like one day after, a workshop is going to be held, and there are going to be breakout sessions for the task force as well. So we'll have the chance to speak next month again. The save the date email for this is going to be sent out soon. And then the final deadline for like the final draft for the policy briefs is going to be submitted in July. So we're going to continue the written and the discussion parts and work in our policy briefs for the time being. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. It was my pleasure to host you and to moderate this panel and this webinar, and I hope to see you all very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I wish you all the best, and thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you very much. This was very useful.